All right, we're back with Manuel Mergal this week to discuss some more traditional architecture. Last time we discussed the Forbidden City in China and Voronet Monastery in Romania. So Manuel, take it away.
Great, thank you. So just to recap where we left last time, we had talked about the Forbidden City, and we had said that this was an architecture about separation of the emperor from the masses, from the hoi polloi, from everybody else. And you can clearly see it in this slide in here, how the people are dwarfed by the massive entrance, the Meridian Gate, into the Forbidden City. It's an architecture about control, about force, about the insignificance of the individual and the exaltation of the emperor. Okay, and I don't need to dwell on this too much because we spent a lot of time on all of these slides before, but I wanted to make that point because traditional architecture is about telling a story with the building. Well, all architecture is about telling a story with what you're building. So this is the story that this type of architecture is telling in China. Then in terms of Voronet, we had quoted an important thinker from the George Balls, who was a writer from the 1920s, who had said that these churches of the Romania, Moldova area, some people call them the painted churches of Moldova, some other people call them the painted churches of Suceava. It's basically the Romanian and Moldovan northern border of Romania with Moldova. He had talked about them being Byzantine churches built by Gothic hands. And I was dwelling on that wanted to dwell on that a little bit longer because the idea, part of the idea comes from, well, let's look at the Gothic, right? What is the Gothic? And there is a notion of something called heavenly mansions, right? Which was brought on by Sir John Somerson in a book that he wrote by the same name, Heavenly Mansions. And in fact, in the first chapter of this book, the name of the chapter is Heavenly Mansions, an Interpretation of the Gothic. He says of this architecture that it shows a profound desire to dissolve the heavy prose of the building into religious poetry, a desire to transform the heavy man-made temple into a multiple, imponderable pile of heavenly mansions. When I read that many, many years ago, I thought of the quote, I believe is in St. John chapter 14, verse 2, but please correct me if I'm wrong, where he says, in my Father's house, there are many mansions, or there are many dwellings, depending on your translation. And so you can see in here on my screen, this is Chartres. Chartres was completed in 1252. Okay, remember that Voronet was in the 1400s, early 1400s. So almost 2 centuries before, Chartres had been built already. Note the tracery, and note that all of these are small ediculas, okay? Small little temples, basically, that make up the overall composition, the overall building composition. And if you will, inside each edicula, sometimes you do have the statue of arguably a saint or an important person or a patron or an angel, okay? And you see that on the interior also. Now, if that is not what we have here at Voronet, then, oops, sorry. What happened here with my screen? Okay, then I give up, right? Because that you see that very clearly shown in each all of these images are surrounded by a space that delineates an edicula, okay? So it's about, basically, it's also about heavenly mansions, okay? And you have that, I wanna go to this slide. You have that on the inside, and this is going to relate a lot to the next building that we're gonna talk about, because the next building is a Gothic building, albeit also not exactly a copy of a French building, right? The next building that we're going to talk about is Seville. This is Boronet on the inside. Again, in a strange way, these interpenetrating vaults coupled with images where no space is left blank and ediculas dematerializes the wall in a similar way that a Gothic architecture dematerializes walls as well. Okay, so that, I think that's an important point when we start talking about the cathedral in Seville, because in Seville, here's the thing, it was built over a mosque, okay? This was the site of a mosque in 1172 to 1248, okay? So it was Christianized in 1248, but they didn't start really building the cathedral until the city leaders decided to do so in 1401. And in fact, there's a quote about the city leaders. I'm not sure how they got this quote, but it says, the quote says like this: "Let us build a church so beautiful and so grand that those who see it finished will think we were mad." Okay. In fact, this is the largest medieval cathedral in Europe. And after St. Peter's, it's the largest Catholic church in the world. Okay, it was built over a mosque, as I said. And you can see here, most people know the Giralda Tower in Sevilla because it's such an identifying monument to Seville. So the Giralda Tower is actually a minaret from the old mosque. The Patio de los Naranjos, basically the orange tree courtyard, was the old entrance to the mosque. So you entered into, before you entered into the mosque, which is here, or was here, you had to go through the Patio de los, through this area in here, which was like a gathering space for everyone. Okay, now look at the location of all the columns inside, and you will see that almost all the base faces are almost equal except for the center one. But even the center one is not so different. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 aisles across. Okay. In most Gothic cathedrals, French Gothic cathedrals, you only have 3 aisles. That's an important consideration because, I mean, the reason you have 5 aisles in here is because this was built using the old foundations of the mosque. So this is Gothic, but it's Spanish Gothic, and at that it's civilian Spanish Gothic. Okay, so this is a subset of a subset of a subset. Another thing that is important to consider is that when we think of Gothic, we think of pointed arches, okay? We think of a particular style of architecture. This complex was built over time, okay? So you have, in this complex, you have this part, which was built back by the Moors, and in fact, all the foundation was built by the Moors. You have the Gothic part that was started in 1434. After they decided in 1401 that they wanted to build this church, it took about 33 years before they actually started. I guess they needed to get the money to build it, right? And that takes time. This part in here is Renaissance. This part is the Sacristia Mayor, the main sacristy. And it was built in 1528. Okay, this part in here is called the Dependencia de la Hermandad Sacramental. I also know it as the Archivo de las Indias because across the street in Seville, you have the big building that is called the Archivo de las Indias. So people call these two buildings Archivo de las Indias as well, the archives of the Indies. This was a more 18th, 19th century piece that was added in here. And this piece in here, the Sagrario, the sacristy, was a Baroque piece built in 1618 to 1758. So this is a collection of stuff. This church is not pure Gothic like you have some churches in France, like Chartres or Notre Dame in Paris, or Amiens Cathedral, right? Now, the 5 bays, you have them here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This church, and from my memory fails because last time I was here was in 2017, but from what I remember, this is a pretty good depiction of what the church looks like inside. It's not your typical French Gothic church. It does have ribbed vaults like other Gothic churches. It does have pointed arches like other Gothic churches. But notice, and you're gonna see in the, let me just get you to the next slide. Notice the difference between this Gothic church, which is Chartres, completed in 1252. Notice that there's a lot more glass, a lot more ratio of void to solid is different in here than in here. There's a lot more solid in this church and less void, okay? So that's a significant difference. Also, a significant difference is the fact that these bays, as I said before, are almost all the same size, whereas in Chartres, you will see that the side aisles, and there's only 3 in the main nave, the side aisles are smaller than the main nave. Therefore, that contributes to the feeling of more light inside the church, okay? Now, this is the Patio de los Naranjos, the orange court, orange tree court. And so this was virtually the way that the Moors had built it way back when, this area. And the Giralda Tower is here. The Giralda Tower used to be a minaret, and it used to end roughly at this point where my cursor is. Can you see my cursor? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, so that it used to end here. This part was added later. This is the Renaissance stuff, was added in 1458, roughly. And it ended up the Giraldillo, which is a weather vane up here. Very heavy weather vane because it weighs about 15 tons or more, but it's still a weather vane. It swings with depending on where the breeze is coming from. The Giraldillo was topped in 1568. Now notice the resemblance. Notice the Moorish architecture. This was all done by the Moors, and it was left that way until this was added, and then this was added later, as I said, in 1458. Notice the resemblance between this and the model that they used to build the Giralda Tower. This is the Kotoibia Mosque in Marrakesh, Morocco. And this is a courtyard before you enter. This is a similar courtyard to the Patio de los Naranjos. It's just that they didn't have orange trees in Morocco. But there's a mosque back there. And the mosque is basically a huge space, probably 5 bays wide, also like the old mosque in Seville. Okay, so note the resemblance in massing and general fenestration, the ratio of openings to massing in the Giralda with the Kotoibia Mosque. I'm going to go back to the Giralda one more time.
Did the Spanish add to the height? I noticed the one in Marrakesh, there's quite short, the mosque itself, aside from the minaret.
Yes, of course, yeah. The mosque in Spain, okay, let's go back. The mosque in Spain probably ended up somewhere around here. Okay. So all of this was added, and you can tell that all of these flying buttresses are basically imitating the flying buttresses. They're bringing the construction technology that is used in the rest of Europe to build cathedrals. They're bringing it to Spain and adapting it to what they already had in here. They already had the mosque down here. They may have even these openings. I don't know this for a fact, so I would need to do some more research about this, but some of these openings may have already been here and they simply made them pointed arches. Now look at this opening on this side. You can see that this is a Moroccan arch. Okay, whereas this is a pointed arch. So it may be that this was similar. I'm not sure, but yes, this was built on top of literally on top of the old mosque. That's a good question. So here's the main sacristy that you see here. You can see the dome of the main sacristy beyond here. You can see the Giralda back there. So this is on the east. This is the eastern facade of the church. Okay, this is the main altar is behind here. Okay, so the main sacristy was built during Renaissance times, 1528 to 1547. This area here. Okay, this is a close up of the main sacristy with the main altar back there and the Giralda Tower in the background. Okay, so this gives you a sense of Gothic in Spain, in Seville. I mean, you do get your pointed arches, but as I said before, the ratio of solid to void is almost the reverse of what you would have in a Gothic church in France, right? You have the flying buttresses, but I guess the Spanish perhaps were not so confident that these buttresses would hold up the wall, so they still put a lot of masonry in between those windows. Okay, the Spanish are doing what the Spanish do. They build in stone. They're building stone. They're not doing what the French do. You know, to this day, the Spanish and the French don't, different, right? So they're doing their Spanish thing. Definitely not your typical Gothic cathedral by Abbot Suger invented it, though it does resemble one. Anyway, I'm sorry. Yes, you were going to ask something.
Well, I was just going to ask here. So this building, it's less symmetrical, perhaps, and that probably has to do with its construction being, added to a mosque and then other pieces added over time. But is there something to that of the Spanish style of, the French one that strikes me is they try to have a lot of symmetry of the left has to look like the right, and whereas here it's a little more sprawling, maybe.
That's an interesting question, and I don't know. I can speculate on that. We can, remember that arguably France, I guess we would have to go back in history and try to understand how was the money, it's like when people say today, follow the money. How was the money distributed back then? How did they come up with the money to build these churches? I know from my wife's town, Compostela, that Compostela was built over many, many years, centuries. It started back in the 9th century and then the 12th, and it didn't end until much later. The same thing happened with Seville. The same thing happened, for that matter, with La Sagrada Familia. So it may be a matter of not being able to get all the money together, and perhaps in France, they were able to do it. I'm not sure, so therefore, if you have a smaller construction campaign, then things are more homogeneous, right? If you have a construction campaign that goes through the ages, anything is going to happen. In fact, this right here, this is as we were referring before, this is the Archivo de las Indias. This wasn't added until 1758 to 1823. So yeah, I think it's a result of a building campaign that lasts for a long time. Now, it is a fantastically lovely composition, in my opinion. I mean, when you look at it, you go, wow, this is really, with all these spires. So there is a certain unity in the diversity that they were able to achieve, even though this was built through so many centuries, right?
You
here's
mentioned the Archivo de las Indias. Obviously, Seville was one of the, I think, the most important port, right, in the Spanish exploration of the New World. So is there any of the history of that connect at all to the building, or just the history of the cathedral that you know of?
I think there is. When I was there, I wanted to, vain that I am, I wanted to find out where the Mergals came from, and I wanted to go to the Archivo de las Indias and see if we could find something about my ancestors. But alas, I wasn't able to get in there. But yes, there is a lot of. That's what it is about. It's about the history of all these. They called us the Indias, and the loss of the Indies. Actually, that's how, for instance, San Juan was, and many other cities in the New World were built following the loss of the Indies. So it's all related. Yes, there is a fantastic relationship there. Anyway, this entrance, we're still on the view from the south here. This entrance, I wanted to bring everybody's attention to the lace quality of the carved stone, which is different than what the French did. The French have similar carving, but their carving is done to bring light through. In between the stone carving, you're bringing light. In here, the carving is applied to the stone, and it's almost like you would have in a piece of fabric that has lace around it, a collar around. Look at the lace around the round window there, the rose windows, right? And it's interesting that when you look at French cathedrals, all of these are bases. Okay, these are bases for statues, but in here the statues are missing. Okay, you can see that better, I think, in the next photographs. These are all bases for statues, and the statues are all missing. You wonder why? I have no idea why. I can't tell you why. But all I know is that there is something that's missing here when you look at it, compare it with the Gothic.
They're honoring the imageless spirit, I guess, of the Islamic previous life, right?
Either that, or this is meant to be for us, like for us to imagine ourselves in here in the future, one or the other. I don't know, but yeah, maybe they are. Maybe there's something about the architects saying being influenced by the "Thou shalt not carve or worship graven images," the mandate in the Quran or somewhere like that. Anyway, so yeah, Gothic in here. This is definitely Gothic, albeit the Spanish version, flanked by Renaissance on one side and the academic style of the Archivo de las Indias on the other, establishing an architectural dialogue between three very different pieces, but that still somehow go together.
Would you call the Archivo piece sort of neoclassical, or what?
Yes.
How would you classify that?
Yes, it's academic neoclassicism. Yes, that's a good term for it. Again, look at this is almost a closer up view. Notice that this base is missing the statue that should be here, whereas this base has its statue right on top, and this base has its statue on top. So I don't know what happened in here. But there is a tension, I think, between the stone lace that you have here, the idea of the heavenly mansions. These are all heavenly mansions, okay? Going up the building, putting together the building is different than the French tracery. This is more like lace as opposed to tracery from the French. Maybe it's semantics, but it is similar. And goodness gracious, look at what we have here. Heavenly mansions at the main altar. And if this doesn't recall the exterior of Voronet, I don't know what does, right? But this is basically a three-dimensional image of Voronet inside the cathedral of Seville.
If you could go back for a second, though, there was just one question I had there. The tower on the top right there, it has kind of that diagonal circular, the tower all the way on the right. See the sort of diagonal circular lines going up there. That almost reminds me of, I wonder if that inspired Sagrada Familia a little bit.
You know, you could be right. I don't know. I'm sure Gaudí was a devout Catholic, and like any other architect, he would have been looking at precedents before he built what he built. Actually, it's interesting. I wanted to note also that this on the left, this is the north side, and this one on the right is on the south side. Okay, so these are different entrances. This is from the Patio de los Naranjos in here. You can see the Naranjos. Okay, so this is why this is not in direct sunlight, because it's facing north. But it's interesting. They were both done. These were both finished. I think they were ended up finished in the 20th century. So these people were carving for a long time. But notice, so you can tell the similarities, therefore, between the two of them, you know, since they were finished at similar times. Anyway, heavenly mansions. The building is a collection of small buildings, and it is a collection of images. And even though the Taj Mahal is Islamic, essentially, it's Indian, but it's Islamic Indian. It's Mughal, which is the next building that we're going to look at. The Taj Mahal is also writing in stone. These buildings are basically writing, telling a story, writing in stone. Okay. So that brings us to the Taj Mahal, Mughal, India. Anyway, so they're coming from the north into India, and they have this fabulous empire. These Mughals are warriors, okay, but they're also lovers of art. Okay. Fascinating group of people, because their influence, they bring the idea of the Persian garden into the architecture of India. And I'm going to get into this in a moment, but since we're connecting heavenly mansions with the Taj Mahal, and heavenly mansions has to do with heaven, right? The Persian garden is a recreation of paradise on earth. In fact, paradiso, the word paradise, paradiso in Italian, paradisiacal, has to do with pared in Spanish, wall. Okay, pared, paradiso. Pared, a walled garden, is basically what all of these buildings, all of these places around the river Jama, are, these houses all belong to members of the imperial family, Mughal emperor, at this time of the world. So this was built in Agra, and north, by the way, north is pointing this way. North is to the left. Okay, so this back here is north. So you need to make that connection. need to make that shift in your mind that north is to the left. So this was built in Agra in 1632. Okay, 1632. Seville was started in the 1400s. This is 2 centuries after. 2 centuries also after Voronet. Okay. By the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan to house the tomb of his favorite wife, Mumtaz Mahal. Now, Shah Jahan was the son of Jahangir and the grandson of Akbar, all of them great art patrons. Okay, so these people knew what they were doing. They were immersed in this artistic culture from the cradle, and they were immensely wealthy. They had immense wealth. Okay. So all the owners of the riverfront, as I said before, are members of the imperial families and their nobilities. Okay. And I'm getting this information from Eva Koch. And Eva Koch wrote an article about this that appeared in the journal Storage, which is an electronic database created in New York City in 1995. So I just wanted to give credit where credit is due. He wrote an article called "The Taj Mahal Architecture, Symbolism, and the Urban Significance." So many of these images are from his article. Okay, so the Mughals brought Persian culture and Islam to India from 1526 to 1757. And they conceived a garden type to take advantage of this waterfront situation, okay? So usually, instead of putting the building in the center of the garden, they put the building next to the river up here. So the Taj Mahal is number 1. Number 2 is a mosque. And number 3 is this number 3 here is like a guest house or a hall or a party place, basically. Okay, because you're not going to have your party, if you're having a party, you're not going to have it in the tomb. This is number 1, is basically a tomb, right? So the main building was not placed in the center of the garden as in a classical Mughal Charbagh. Charbagh is a Mughal garden, but rather on an oblong terrace, which they call a kursi, running along the riverfront. The garden component in here was landward in here, okay? So, and in here, this is the entrance. This is the big entrance that you're going to see in later pictures into the garden, the Paradise Garden, the Paradiso Pared, which is here and here all around. There's a big pared, a big wall, okay? And these are smaller versions of, this is a smaller version of the same idea. So these were houses for the caretakers. I could have been a caretaker in that part of the world. That would have been nice. Anyway, so symmetrical building with 4 minarets. Everything is symmetrical, and notice the composition is in 3s. So 1, 2, 3. Everything is in 3s. Center, side, side. Very important. On the surrounding buildings, the same thing. The number 3, you're going to see everywhere. Okay, this is an important principle of this type of architecture.
Does it have a just a practical structural function or some sort of symbolic meaning, or what's the?
I haven't found the symbolic meaning, though I can speculate on it, but I haven't read specifically. I just know that this was an important principle for them. So this is on a plinth. You see the plinth here, next to the river Jama or Jamuna. Okay, it's topped by a large dome with a finial. And the crescent moon, it's hard to see there, the Islamic symbol. The smaller domes are called chatris or kiosks. They have a similar shape to the dome, and they have guildastas or decorative spires Okay, so this is all emphasizes basically is to underline the dome, which I don't think needs any underlining, but so be it. Here's a view from the entrance into the garden in here. Okay, and then the Taj Mahal in the distance. Okay, so a charba, which is this garden in here, is a Persian garden or Indo-Persian garden that is a quadrilateral, has a quadrilateral layout and based on the four gardens of paradise mentioned in the Quran. It is divided by walkways and or uh, flowing water. And in fact, you have both in here, flowing water and walkways.
How much is the current layout of the garden revised maybe in a more Western style? Because it strikes me as having kind of a very, you know, Enlightenment sort of geometric shape, and then the lawn kind of seems very, very European.
That's a very good question. When the British, let me go back to that. When the British came here, um, this was a lot. There are photographs that I have seen where this is a lot more lush vegetation, and in fact, the view of the Taj Mahal is very tightly framed to the point where you just see this almost a central portion, and you don't see anything else because this is so densely forested. So I don't know how much of this is the influence of the British or the influence of the new government in India or new scholarship. I doubt that it's new scholarship, but maybe. But it's a good question. I think definitely this has been altered from the original conception. But the point is still the same, that there was always the idea of having the um, four gardens of paradise that are mentioned in the Quran, and you have that over and over and over in many of these, and then even in here you see subdivisions of this the four gardens, right? So it's a governing principle. It's basically representing the Garden of Paradise. And here we go. Look at that. We have ediculas. We have small buildings inscribed all over the facade of the Taj Mahal. And look at that, the number three. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. This keeps recurring over and over and over. Okay, we even have pointed arches that relate to maybe Gothic architecture. Dare I say that? So the exterior decoration uses calligraphy because they can't use, they're prohibited from using a figural sculpture or painting, but they can use calligraphy. They can use vegetation forms. They can use abstract geometry. Okay. And these items that look like they're basically dark stone, they end up being colorful stones. They do have colorful stones. Did I lose you? Are you still there?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So you can see here how colorful the stones are. These stones are called pietra dura by the conoscenti nowadays. I doubt that the Mughals called them pietra dura, but today they call them that. But this is the detail of what you were looking at up here, of this area up here in the previous slide. Okay, so the principles which apply just as well to Western European architecture are those of symmetry. The E1 entrance is very symmetrical. Look at the number of 3, 1, 2, 3, and then within the entrance itself, you have 1, 2, 3 vertically arranged and horizontally. 1, 2, 3 in the center of the entrance as well. Okay, so there's the principle of hierarchy, of symmetricality, even the ornament is perfectly symmetrical. So what you have on one side of the E1 is exactly the same as on the other side of the E1. Now, we in the West are not, many times are not as insistent on perfect symmetry as this type of architecture is. There's a sensuous attention to detail, there's a selective use of naturalism, and there's a lot of symbolism in this type of architecture. And the geometrical symbols abound all over. This is a geometrical sun screen. Sun is very intense in this part of the world, so instead of wanting to have sun inside, they shun the sun on the inside. They don't want sun on the inside because it's too hot. So this is a plan of the Taj Mahal, and in the center you have the cenotaph. It's a cenotaph, which is up here. You see it in section, because the actual tomb is underground. So what you have here is the representation of the tomb, or a cenotaph, on the first floor. Okay. Here's the inside of one of the side buildings, either the mosque or the guest house, I'm not sure. The walls are very thick, so that helps to cool the interiors, and the screens, the sun screens, prevent the sun from coming in unless it's at a very low angle, like you see in this picture. Okay. Here's the interior of the Taj Mahal from Getty Images. Look at the ediculus in here, again in threes, 1, 2, 3. Okay. And remember that 3, when we discussed China, 3 was a number that was important for the Chinese also, because the imperial buildings were in groups of 3. So this is a cross-cultural thing that we have here. And note the vegetative ornamentation in here. And that's very important, that you have vegetation, because you're basically recreating the Garden of Paradise inside the building. Okay, it's the concept of paradisiacal garden house, which is expressed in the dados, or wainscot of the building at eye level, which transfigures the lower walls of the mausoleum in here. This is the mausoleum, or the cenotaph. It transfigures the walls into an ever-blooming, since these guys are never going to wilt because they are in stone, right? It's an ever-blooming paradisiacal flower beds, basically, a flower garden. Okay. So this is an earthly representation of the heavenly mansion in the Garden of Paradise. Okay. That's what, and the idea of this garden of paradise, a representation of the heavenly mansion, Garden of Paradise. Garden is the operant word that brings us into the next building that we can talk about, which is Katsura. But before we get into Katsura, I want to bring your attention to the fact that this was, I said, built in 16, did I say 1630? Let me go back to my notes in here. 1632 to 1653. Okay, so meanwhile, back at the ranch in Rome, Michelangelo was appointed architect of St. Peter in 1546. Philip II in Spain was ruling Spain from 1556 to 1598. That's when his main building, the Escorial, was built. Okay, the Escorial is basically a recreation of the Temple of Solomon. Okay, Bernini was doing the arcades of St. Peter, the arms of St. Peter in 1637. Okay, Louis XIV was working on his Versailles in France 1643 to 1715, 72 years that they had under Louis XIV. And one of my favorite architects, Jacques-Ange Gabriel, was building the Petit Trianon for Marie Antoinette between 1762 and 1768. So this puts you in contact with, in terms of time frame, puts you in context with where we are. And Katsura, which is the next building. Oops. Before we go,
I've got a couple questions back here about this one. Actually, this slide is okay. So, you know, with the Imperial Palace, you had stressed a couple times sort of the message of sort of the emperor's greatness and sort of the insignificance of you know, the hoi polloi. So with here, especially with this image of the Taj Mahal, there's obviously the same sense of the building's grandeur, you know, compared to the tiny, puny little people there on the bottom right. But I wonder if you think that it is meant to convey quite the same message, or if there's something else that's supposed to be conveyed by its size in comparison to the people.
There is, well, both are empires, right? The Persians / Mughal Empire was a formidable empire, and whenever you have an empire, you have an expression of that, I think, in the architecture. And apparently, this woman must have been very special for him, because he built the quintessential, I mean, the Taj Mahal in many ways represents India, for good or for bad, but you know, we associate it in our minds with India, and it is, as I said before, it is a recreation of the paradisiacal garden, the Garden of Paradise in stone, in architecture. So what gives is, are we as human beings trying to harness the immensity of God in architecture in some way, and so we can't quite express it, so we use stone and sculpture and painting to the best of our abilities, and those that have more money can build grander, and those that don't can't. But alas, they do what they can, like what Voronet say. I don't know. I don't know the answer, but it is, the architecture can be used. The expressive power of architecture can be used in many ways. So in a society like China, where the emperor was the supreme being, the almost like a god in a way, or at least a representative in some way of God on earth for the Chinese. Perhaps I'm speculating now, but you know, that has implications for the architecture, and to try to express the idea of the Garden of Paradise in three-dimensional form in architecture, the Taj Mahal has implications for exactly for how it's built, and to put together a lot of ediculas and make them into heavenly mansions, whether it's in Chartres or in Seville or in Voronet, has implications for how you do that with the architecture, right? I think that's the message, is that all of these buildings are expressing ideas, religion, and they usually have to do with the nature of the human being and its relationship to something beyond the human being, our relationship to either the cosmos, like in Chinese architecture, to nature, to the cosmos, or I remember when we started talking about Chinese architecture and about classical architecture, one of my first words was that the first, perhaps the first act of architecture was Stonehenge, which is a harnessing of the heavens to be able to understand how, when to plant and when to cultivate and when to harvest, right? So I think that, yeah, that we're always trying to deal with that. And the next building, Katsura, is the Japanese expression of basically of Zen Buddhism and other religious ideas of the Japanese that are being expressed in the architecture.
Good. Well, I'll look forward to hearing about that one in our next get together.
Excellent.
All right. Thank you, Manuel.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.